Pax vobiscum. Welcome to, I guess we could call it an episode of Before We Read. So I wanted to do a Before We Read video for the next book we shall be reading and discussing on this channel, The Cradle of the Deep by Joan Lowell. And I just wanted to go ahead and talk about the book a little bit and provide some background, because the book is not quite what it seems at first glance. There is nothing wrong with that per se, but because of some themes that were in the book when I read it myself, I still decided to go ahead and read it for this channel, but I wanted to do a Before We Read so we could discuss some elements of it so that you aren't surprised when we get to them. And before we begin, I'd like to say something about books in general, and about why we are reading a book some would consider controversial. Honestly, if you think about it, books are like time machines, giving us a glimpse into the minds and values and sometimes dreams of those past. But not all stories age gracefully, and Cradle of the Deep by Joan Lowell is one of those books that invites us to read it with a rather critical eye. Today we'll dive into this strange and controversial book just a little so you get an idea of what we're getting into. And we're not going to just enjoy its thrilling tales of a life at sea, but we're also going to explore its place in history, its flaws. Books are more than just stories. They are snapshots of their time. They reflect the beliefs, values, and perspectives of the people who wrote them and who raised them and the world they currently live in. It doesn't mean they always align with our modern views, or to say that they even aligned with the views of others at the time of them writing it. And Cradle of the Deep is a perfect example of this. This book is famous not just for thrilling maritime adventures, but also for the controversy surrounding its authenticity, and in some cases, and more recent flavors, the attitudes that it reflects. We're going to unpack what this book can tell us about storytelling, about how people view the world nearly a century ago, and about how far we've come in understanding different cultures, ethics, and even truth itself. So as we go through this book, look at it through that sort of critical eye. A sort of time plate, a time capsule, a cultural artifact. A way to engage with the past critically, thoughtfully, and with an open mind. And I encourage you to join the discussion as we reflect on both the good and bad of its story. So now let's talk a little bit about the history behind Cradle of the Deep. When this book was first published in 1929, it became an instant bestseller. Joan Lowell claimed it was her autobiography, a thrilling account of her childhood spent aboard her father's ship, facing wild adventures on the high seas. Readers were captivated by her vivid descriptions of shipwrecks, exotic locations, and all sorts of dramatics. And sometimes her experiences were downright harrowing. But this is where things get a little interesting. Not long after its release, it was revealed that most of the book wasn't actually true. Now, Joan Lowell was born as Helen Wagner, and she actually was an actress in Hollywood for a while before she decided to turn her hand to writing. And in this, investigators found that Joan Lowell, Helen Wagner, had only spent a brief time aboard her father's ship. I believe it was less than a year. And much of what she described is either exaggerated or completely fabricated. This revelation caused quite the scandal, and significantly tarnished the book's reputation, though it continued to sell quite well. In fact, it did so well for itself that another author felt the need to write a book called Saltwater Taffy as a sort of parody of that book. As I mentioned, even though the book had many inaccuracies, and most of it just wasn't even true, people continued to purchase it. And looking at it, and its popularity as we have so many copies of it, we can sort of look at it in the sense of it being a fascinating artifact of its time. It reflects a highly romanticized view of maritime adventure that was popular in the early 20th century, at a time when the idea of the sea was still wrapped with mystique and danger, and was sort of the transition time from the idea of the sailing ship over to steam and coal and oil. It also provides insight into how storytelling is used to captivate audiences, even if it means blurring the lines between fact and fiction. I'd like to take a moment to sort of share my own personal perspective of Cradle of the Deep. I'm fully aware that there are aspects of this book that might feel problematic or uncomfortable to many who happen to read it. I know for myself personally, reading through the book, there were times when my eyebrow would raise, and I would think, oh my goodness, this is interesting. What exactly is going on here? And oh my goodness, is this really happening right now? But if we think about it in the context of it being a fictional story, not that that makes it any better, if it had been even true, some of the things that, as you will see, she depicts in her story, Joan Lowell. But I think it is important to understand that as she's writing this book, she is twisting the truth, twisting fact into fiction, and I think a lot of what gave the autobiography its bite was not only just the romanticized view of maritime adventures at the time, but it was how she sort of used these different things as shock value. I couldn't find in my research if certain things in the story actually happened to her, but there are some things that I truly hope did not. But when you look at it in the sense of shock value, and she's trying to write something where she's really trying to sell this idea of, oh, me, a girl on this ship among all these rough and tough men, and how do I navigate it? When you sort of look at it through that lens, it makes some of the things that she writes about a bit more palatable. I think it is important to read books critically, not just to enjoy aspects of the stories, as even in Cradle of the Deep, as problematic as some of the sections are, I found myself reading it through an afternoon. But it's not just about reading it critically, which I think is very important, and enjoying the stories, which I think is also important, but I think it is a very important trait of human beings to be able to read things that make them uncomfortable, and being comfortable with the uncomfortableness and acknowledging that being uncomfortable means that, especially when you read some of the things in this book, is I am uncomfortable because I know intrinsically that this is wrong. So you can read a book and you can understand what's going on and you can understand the history behind it without acknowledging that what is happening is good, without acknowledging that what happened is true. You can think about it critically and then use the book as an example to describe something as, we do not want to be like this, or as a sort of, as we've mentioned before, a historical lens to see, oh, this person at this point in time, this was their perspective of the world. And I think that is a very important thing to do, because when you are able to step into the shoes of another, whether it is through their literature or non-fiction work, it sort of helps you understand humanity a little more, understands your own humanity a little more, and maybe in ways identifies ways that you yourself need to grow in, or maybe it will inspire you to champion a cause to be able to help others that the book makes you think of. And now before we start reading the book proper, I would like to offer some expectations to you, dear listener, for Cradle of the Deep. It does contain content and language that may be considered offensive or outdated by many of today's standards. There are moments in the book where the language, views, and behaviors reflect prejudices or norms that maybe that we would see in the early 20th century. Things that we recognize now as something that, that is not all right. As we read, it is important, once again, to remember that the book is a product of its time. This doesn't mean that we have to accept or agree with everything in it, but it does give us a chance to think critically about how far we've come, and how much more we still have to learn. So, while some parts may be challenging for myself to read and for yourself to hear, I hope we can approach them with open minds and thoughtful analysis. Stories have the power to entertain, challenge, and teach us, even when they are imperfect. And I would argue that they are even more so able to teach when they are imperfect, such as Cradle of the Deep. It is one of those books that invites us to think critically about the past, about the stories we tell. As we read this book together, let's approach it with curiosity, reflection, and most importantly, an open mind. I am excited to explore this strange, controversial story with you, not just for what's on the surface, but for the deeper conversations it can spark. And so, without further ado, let's dive in together and see where this journey will take us.